Kia ora tato, good morning, and it's a huge pleasure to be back in the Bay, and as ever I'm going to try and say a fair amount, but I've prepared a much larger presentation than I'm going to show. So at any point there's detail on the slide you'd like to have a good look at, or you'd like to have some more slides around a particular issue, it'll all be in the PDF. So I'll make sure that I've left that behind, and before we finish up today, I'll be able to let you know how to easily get access to it. In many ways, I'm going to be picking up on themes from Peter about how local democracy is changing around the world and why it is in terms of economic and social and political issues. So what's going on around the world is a whole bunch of hugely interdependent, interrelated global challenges or problems. And whilst we have to achieve some global progress on those, I'm very struck by how all the best progress is being made locally that then aggregates up across a national picture or an international one as well. But the second theme in there is that given the scale of the challenges, the need is crucial to be pretty radical. So radical is the new normal in a number of ways across the piece. Now I'm going to step through this in this way. I'm going to say very little about the world, lots more in the PDF, and give you a few tantalizing examples of what radical looks like. Then I'm going to say a very little bit about New Zealand economically, but I'm going to dwell on a paradox about our abundant opportunity, but what really needs to happen to drive that opportunity. Then I'm going to talk about revolution. What would it look like in New Zealand if we were playing to these global themes, which are absolutely brilliant for us, but we aren't at the moment? So what will we do about that? Then lastly, I'm going to talk about complexity. And I'm going to make the case that whilst local governments, global organizations are really important about dealing with the complexity of these issues, it's actually, again, a local community, if it's properly resourced in terms of knowledge and capable people and the rest and good processes, that are actually best able to deal with that level of complexity. I'm going to start at this point by contrasting two fascinating periods. One is the global financial crisis, and I'll explain in a moment what the DSC is. It's a new phrase I'm trying to get off the ground. The global financial crisis was, in essence, pretty straightforward. 4 times in 12 months between late 2007 and late 2008, the global financial system completely locked up, absolutely stuffed with bad debt, toxic assets, and the rest. It was actually pretty easy to solve it. It just took trillions of dollars and euros and everything else. There was lots of political will, there was quite a lot of public support. That worked very fast, and markets were reassured, and we moved on to the current phase. But nothing was actually done with the underlying issues. So now we're in the DSC, which is domestic stagnation crisis. So what's going on around the world is that there's long-running structural crises in economies, and it's not just about finance. It's about resources, energy use, social, it just goes on and on. And this reflects the acceleration and piling up of these great challenges. There's a remarkable lack of political will in virtually every country, and indeed lack of public support to be really active on these issues. And where there is will and support, it still only works slowly because these are very complicated issues. Whilst stock markets are pretty buoyant at the moment, there's still a very deep underlying fear about, from the investment community about where all this is taking us. So very many individual companies or industries or regions or countries are actually very stuck. They don't know what to do. And in due course, I'll make the case that in New Zealand, we're very stuck as well. One useful way to look at the interdependence of these risks is the very good annual risk assessment from the World Economic Forum, the people who bring us Davos every year, the absolute height of the globalized business. Now, in their report last year, they identified on this chart, don't worry, the details are very apparent in the PDF, across the bottom is the impact of any given risk, and up the side is the likelihood of that happening. So if you're looking up in the top right, there's a whole bunch of stuff there about food, about water, about financial risk. So big, very high probability of these issues happening and having an impact, and very considerable impact when it does happen. That was interesting, but what was more interesting was the World Economic Forum, the business leaders of the world, asked themselves a very interesting question. Was the Occupy movement just a weird little anomaly of the global financial crisis, or was it a harbinger of social unrest to come? And they concluded it was a harbinger. So, in other words, if we aren't dealing with these issues, the probability of social unrest and some not necessarily as benign expressions of that unrest as the Occupy movement become a great deal more intense. Seeking some solace on all this, I went off to Rio de Janeiro in June last year. And when I arrived, it was particularly murky. Christ the Redeemer offered no hope at all. Neither did these people. These are the world leaders. They signed off on a 283 paragraph statement at the summit. Our representative in the far top left-hand corner there, right-hand corner, was Amy Adams, because the Prime Minister was otherwise occupied. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he wasn't there. Amy Adams said of that consensus agreement, the fact we have a consensus outcome document at all, and the 283 statements within it, is truly testament to the abilities and goodwill of everyone who attended. However, there was a problem with the 283 paragraphs. If you analyze them, 99 times the world leaders said we support, 50 times they said we encourage, 5 times they said we will, and 3 times they said we must. So we've got all these huge interdependent issues going on in the world, and only in 3 paragraphs did they say we must. This was the longest suicide note in history, was the wonderful tweet from Kumi Naidu of Greenpeace. Needless to say, people took to the streets in a rather Brazilian fashion. What was quite fascinating was that not just outside the conference, but inside, because there were 55,000 delegates, this was the first attempt to bring civil society in a very big way. So it wasn't a government conference, it was very much a civil society conference in a very big way. And that marvelous panoply of humankind was there to be seen. So this was a couple of gents I was talking to one lunchtime. One on the left, a Muslim from the Philippines, and the other a Sioux Indian from North Dakota. Slightly less exotic, but no less important, was the New Zealand delegation. Ours was notable for a number of reasons. The first is, I wasn't able to check across all the countries there, but it struck me that our delegation really was an expression of civil society. So, for example, New Zealand was the only country delegation that had a doctor in it. Rather important, because those 283 paragraphs included quite a lot about health, whether it be sexual health and reproduction health and women's rights or public health. Our representative was an Auckland public health doctor, young doctor called Sudhir Singh, and Sudhir was very involved in the negotiations of that text to push back against some massive inroads, the Vatican, because the Vatican is recognized as a negotiating entity in the UN, against all the progress that had been made in recent years. And Sudhir, Auckland doctor, was there arguing the case from a medical point of view to help push back against that. And the young woman in the bottom left-hand corner you might recognise as Brittany Trilford. Last year she was in her final year of school in Wellington, and she won a worldwide competition to be the lone voice of youth in the General Assembly, and she gave an absolutely fabulous speech. But in the absence of any kind of commitment or progress from central governments, what we saw instead was an extraordinary expression of vocal but binding commitments from all sorts of civil society that was there. So, for example, down the bottom there, 58 of the largest cities in the world made a declaration to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by over 1 billion tonnes by 2030. And of all the groups, and it's unfair to pick on any because many sectors of civil society were very impressive. But for my money, the best program there was the local government program. And the best commitments came from towns and cities around the world. And so you have wonderful organizations like ICLEI, the local government forum for sustainability around the world, which were very impressive. What Rio meant to me was a real signs that we are making progress on the birth of a new democracy. So this is one that's people-led, not politician-led. Now, politicians are still really important, but it's about that participatory democracy that Peter was talking of earlier. This is locally driven, not centrally controlled. It's very interactive. It's not authoritarian. It's very creative, both in itself and what it allows in others, rather than restrictive. It's very networked, locally and globally, not hierarchical. But crucially, it's about communities that can learn rather than stagnate. And I emphasize this question of community. And community, for me these days, comes in two marvelous forms. It's still very local. It's about that physical contact. It's about an event like this that brings people in from around the local community. But of course, given the power of the internet these days and all sorts of ways of using it, it's also about virtual communities. So whether you're in a business or have a particular interest, your ability to connect with people anywhere in the world in a virtual community is astonishingly powerful. But either way, these communities are ones that really can deal with these very big issues. However, this requires these communities to have some essential characteristics. And to my mind, three of them is a common sense, a common understanding of what we're trying to deal with in our local communities. The second one is a common purpose. We decide what we're going to do and we actually get on with it. But above all, this only works if there's a real sense of commonwealth. So whatever the progress is that is achieved, whether it be economic or social or environmental or cultural or whatever, actually is widely shared. And these then become places where people are encouraged to get involved. But also they're communities that have the courage and conviction to really move a lot faster with a lot more assurance and effectively, but also the compassion to bring everyone else along with them. And not in a drag them along or in a passive way, but finding ways to get as many people involved as this as possible. And then they too will contribute their talents to this. What about radical? Well, when I'm looking for a single place to try and get a fix on how big these challenges are, I often turn to the Vision 2050 document from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Came out 2 years ago. The council is not, flaky people. These are major businesses in the world, the likes of Unilever and the rest. And I find this, the challenges that they articulate are extraordinarily powerful. On this chart, which sums up the essential challenge, across the bottom is the United Nations Human Development Index. So yes, there are lots of countries there on the right with high levels of education, health, longevity, economic well-being. But there's also a long tail of countries with not. The the vertical axis is how much is available in terms of ecosystem biocapacity per person. Now, the higher of the horizontal lines was the level in 1961. That then had dropped down very considerably by 2006 because there were more of us and we were demanding more on that biocapacity. So if we are to be truly sustainable in all senses of the word, not just economic and nice standard of living, but health, education, and everything else, everybody has to be in that blue box by 2050, and nobody is. So that's how big the challenge is. This looks at it another way. Again, I'll leave you to look at the detail, but across the bottom are all the crucial drivers, whether it's people's values or human development or economy, agriculture, forests, energy and power, buildings, transport, materials. The dark blue are all the things we have to do by 2020, only a few years away, if we're to stand any chance of doing all the stuff above that. Now these are very sensible large organizations who are deeply involved in these issues, who are telling us that this is an unprecedented scale, speed, and complexity of change. A couple of glimpses. Nature is very good at a cradle to cradle in terms of everything that nature produces gets ultimately recycled down to parts per billion. That's not how we make things these days, but that's where we need to go. A very challenging concept. It goes far beyond, putting the newspapers out to be repulped or plastic bottles turned into, whatever. Another challenging concept is that far more of our technology needs to mimic nature. And one of the most articulate, most effective exponents of this is Janine Benyus, an American biologist. And she's helped companies develop some very impressive technologies that actually mimic nature and are better technologies. They perform better, but they obviously then fit very comfortably within the ecosystem. One of the examples she uses is that we use crude oil to make 350 man-made polymers and producing rubbish like that in that landfill. But nature uses only 5 natural polymers to make those incredibly complex and functional shapes in insects. So again, that's just a hint of how radically things change. Lastly, when we go back to that concept of how do we make and unmake things, the most challenging concept is about trying to make things essentially atom by atom. And rather than start with a big lump of steel, or indeed coal and iron ore, and you eventually get to steel, and then you start shaping that steel. So that's subtractive manufacturing. It's about additive manufacturing. You build up your required object in an additive way. The crude term used now is 3D printing. But a very remarkably insightful and amazingly ambitious roadmap of what that looks like when you bring bits, information technology, together with atoms comes from Neil Gershenfeld of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he's head of their wonderfully called Center for Bits and Atoms, because this is what they do. I won't even attempt to explain it, but this YouTube clip is absolutely fabulous on it. Okay, so that's kind of some of the stuff happening out in the world. What about New Zealand? Well, our trade partners are growing pretty well, but we're suffering from slow growth. Now, growth won't seem too bad across the country this year and possibly next, but if you net out Christchurch, the blue mountain in the middle, most of the rest of the economy is remarkably stagnant. And once Christchurch is rebuilt, we fall back to our long-term growth rate of barely 2% a year. So there are all sorts of issues around why we aren't earning a bigger, more sustainable living, i.e. we can keep doing it, living in the world economy. Let me give a central insight onto this, which very much focuses all my work. As I travel around the country, I spend a lot of time in the primary sector, but I'm just as at home in IT or science or non-dairy science, all kinds of other science. The arts, you know, I'm promiscuous in my interests. Again, I go back to the World Economic Forum. Every year they produce a global competitiveness report. One of the key measures is how a country creates value, what's its competitive advantage. So, scale of 1 to 7. 1 is very simple. They've got low-cost natural resources. 7 is all the way out the other side. That's unique products and services. So on that, we score 3.7. We're kind of a little way up that value chain. But that ranks us only 48th in the world. The next important step is how much value that you've created do you capture. So again, a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is that you're mostly confined down one end of the scale, such as resource extraction, and 7 is all the way up. You're right engaged with customers, even beyond selling things to them in terms of after-sales service and all the rest. So it's a very intimate relationship, and you've captured value all the way along that value chain. Well, again, happens to be 3.7, but on this, we're 59th. That seems an abstract concept until you hear a piece of news, as popped up early last year, about this very interesting deal. This oversimplifies, but essentially one Fonterra plant makes infant formula in New Zealand for Pfizer, the American multinational. It's a bit more complicated than that because it's not all the product of one plant, and in fact it's coming from others as well. But that's kind of the rough aggregate. I've discussed that with Theo Spearings, the chief executive. Pfizer has this business by accident through acquisitions, but one of the greatest asset is that it has an 8% market share in China for infant formula. Doesn't make the stuff, doesn't have cows, it just has our farmers produce, well, their cows produce the milk and Fonterra to process it for them. Last year, Nestle paid $12 billion for Pfizer's infant formula business. Now, as Theo says, he's given the chairman of Nestle a really hard time about overpaying. And Brabeck kind of said, yeah, perhaps. But even if they paid double what's a reasonable sum, it's still a very large sum of money. But I'll stick with the 12 billion. So essentially one plant and an 8% market share and $12 billion, that $12 billion is 3 times the net asset value of Fonterra. So if you have any doubt about what the true economic value we're getting out of the dairy industry is relative to the total value created or captured, we are nowhere, basically. And we have a dairy industry that is under its model is under quite a lot of stress, economically and environmentally. Now, I say this with huge respect for the dairy industry. I just hope that it has some courage and conviction to move on to do something a bit different with that milk, and I'll come to that in a moment. But that's where we end up. Before the global financial crisis, we produced less value per person per hour worked in New Zealand, because we produce low-value commodities very efficiently, than Greece. We are not the next Greece, because we pay our taxes and we are efficient and we can adapt, which is 3 things the Greeks can't do, apparently. So relax in that sense, but don't give up on the big goal, because quite simply, our economic model has hit the wall. Our whole economy has hit the wall in terms of economically, socially, and environmentally. Now, here's the paradox. Yes, there is abundant opportunity. We get terribly excited about the hundreds of millions of more middle-class Indians and Chinese, and we think we'll be so rich if we only sell them a bit more infant formula. Well, the problem is it's not us selling it, it's Pfizer. But anyway, or selling them a few bottles of wine, or get them, some of them down here on holiday. This doesn't work. The simple maths of this doesn't work. There ain't no way with our existing model that we can increase dairy production in New Zealand, or tourism, or winemaking, to generate the volume that would deliver that big an impact on the economy. But we are seduced by that abundance. We are not understanding that it's not about the cows, it's about the scientists. It's not about the tourists, it's about achieving some real engagement with them. It's not about a gesture towards sustainability. Those are all roads to poverty. What's really driving the world is scarcity. It's not a scarcity of customers, it's a scarcity to be able to, of ideas to be able to reinvent. So yes to milk, but how do we create far more value out of that milk? I'll give you an example in a moment. How do we bring people here for education, for their holidays? They stay longer, they become far more engaged with us. They meet more New Zealanders than just the people who strap them into a bungee jump. And of course, we have that commitment to strong sustainability. So here's the revolution for New Zealand, and there is a framework. Last year was finally published a New Zealand version of 2050, very much influenced and helped by the World Business Council. There's the links to download the New Zealand version and the global version. When you get the PDF, if you just click on those links, it'll take you straight to them. This is a vision for a country, a nation in 2050 where 6 million of us, and I'm very comfortable with that number. I think we can easily accommodate that around the country, not all in Auckland, hopefully, or indeed around this part of the country either. 6 million of us will live very well. Again, in the PDF, you'll see a lot more detail of that blueprint. There are people doing this. One of my favorite companies is Lanzatech, which takes carbon monoxide from the likes of steel mills and turns it into a synthetic fuel, not a biofuel, a synthetic fuel. It's not taking food to produce that. It's a biological process, but the first commercial operation of that starts up in Shanghai later on this year. Here locally, Comvita, and I'm not glossing over Zespri. I often talk I take every opportunity to talk enthusiastically about Zespri's value creation. So Zespri, through growth, through producing kiwi fruit here, but then it's growing overseas with orchardists there. Zespri supplies 1/3 of the total volume of kiwi fruit in the world, but captures 2/3 of the value. So Zespri is a very important model of what we can do. But I'll focus instead on Comvita at this stage because we had a close-run thing back in late 2011 when essentially a Japanese drinks company through its Singapore food company through Cerebus Greggs in Australia bid for Comvita. And they didn't have a clue what they were buying. They essentially saw Comvita as a grocery product. Well, that's not how Comvita sees itself. So if you take a boring old tub of clover honey in a supermarket brand, own label brand, 250 grams of honey and assign a value of 1, when Comvita puts that Manuka honey with very splendid antibacterial qualities, medically proven, in a wound dressing for burns or deep infections, that's a value of 25 in that cream. Or if you put it in an aseptically packed wound dressing, that's 55 times the value. So we don't have a problem here with having a biology-based economy. That's fantastic. We do have a problem with what we do with it, how we create value, how we capture it. And so that's why it was immensely important that Comvita managed to fight off that unwelcome takeover offer. And this is not to be anti-foreign investment. I am all for foreign investment that helps us do things we couldn't do on our own. Cerebus Greggs was the opposite of that. And again, I'll give you an example in a mo of what that might look like. Now, the next thing in this is that towns and cities are incredibly important to us in New Zealand. And one of the things that has struck me over the years is how weird we are, how schizophrenic we are, in that we tend as a nation to define ourselves by our wild and rural parts, and indeed to believe that the rural economy is what keeps us afloat. Both of those are all that's important. But what's weird about that is actually we're one of the most urbanized populations in the world, albeit in small towns and cities. But 87% of us live in towns and cities. That's a higher proportion than in France, Germany, and the UK. But the problem is we don't think about our towns and cities in that way. And so our towns and cities are in big trouble. Our built environments are increasingly unsustainable, and our urban economies are increasingly anemic and inward-looking. So Christchurch, pre-earthquakes, 6,000 of them, had lost its economic rationale. So there were a lot of businesses within the 4 avenues of Christchurch which were hanging on in very bad old buildings on low rents. Auckland, only 9% of Auckland's economic activity has anything to do with the rest of the world. A bit more has to do with the rest of the country. But the Auckland economy serves mostly the Auckland population, and growth comes from expanding population. And well, Wellington thought it was going to get rich on tourism and events, forgetting that those people are low-paid, seasonal, part-time work, so there's not much hope there. And Dunedin is just kind of slipping away. Now, I did have a 2-hour discussion yesterday afternoon with the Economic Development Unit of Dunedin City Council. And it was a very constructive discussion because they've come up with a useful economic development plan, but it's utterly generic. And I was trying to make the case to them that whilst all the themes and analysis they identified was right, nothing enlivened it. Nothing. They want Dunedin to be one of the world's great small cities. Well, fine, but what are you offering the world? And that's where Dunedin is trying to work that out. And these sorts of issues are true across the whole country. So that need to reinvent and reinvigorate our urban communities and economies is huge. It's happening. Wellington struggles. They haven't got far beyond some slogans at the moment. Auckland, though, is interesting. And I know I'm an Aucklander, but I hope that I'm also enough of a journalist to be relatively objective about this. What's going on in Auckland is not about amalgamation. If you go right back to the Royal Commission report, it's about a different local government culture, helped by and informed by a different structure. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing around the council table in Auckland, and I could regale you with stories about most of those councillors have moved on considerably from very, very local issues to truly regional ones. The crucial part of this, though, what has then happened is the Auckland plan is far from perfect. But what I have seen over the last 2 years is a speed and effectiveness of knowledge gathering and decision making about those big regional issues for Auckland, which I've never ever seen before, not just in Auckland, around the country. It's been very impressive. And yes, there's lots to work out, there's lots to get through. We haven't reached the sunny uplands yet, but this is a very big change. But crucially, what happens at the local board level, those poor people on the local boards are working themselves far harder than they ever thought they were going to. But you're seeing local boards that are able to give real expression to their local needs and interests and opportunities. And so it's not amalgamation. It's not about cost saving, although I think it's remarkable about what is being achieved in Auckland on very small increases in rates, setting aside all those difficult issues of smoothing out the anomalies. But the actual overall rates, it's a very small increase. It is about a very different culture that's come about because of the structure and a lot of goodwill and some fabulous people. So please just don't think about amalgamation as a cost-cutting thing. Yes, do worry about how do we do the regional thing but the local thing within a new structure. But as the Royal Commission, go back and read the Royal Commission. Yes, it's about Auckland, but it applies to all of us in New Zealand, is a very, very different view. Christchurch, lots to like about the plan, but is it radical? No, they are building an early 20th century city. Is it zero energy? No, they're going to be building to the same appallingly inefficient energy standards as the rest of the country. Will there be growth? No, there's no economic plan there at all. Is it sustainable? No, not economically, environmentally, socially, not at all. Is it a 21st century city, which was the challenge that Jerry Brownlee put in the foreword to the plan? No, it's not. If you're looking at cities around the world which are very serious about being 21st century city, they're leaving Christchurch for dust. However, this is what it could look like. This is one of the facades saved. So what would be different about Christchurch? And I use this only as a metaphor for the whole country. How about in the centre of Christchurch a 3-story building which is the global centre for dairy nutrigenomics? How do we tailor the nutritional, perhaps even lactopharmaceutical benefits of milk to people's individual genetic needs? On the top floor is wonderful hydroponic grass looked after by Lincoln University with sensational, very healthy, probably non-GM cows. Up the side of the building is a lift because we all want to go and see the cows milk themselves robotically. Now, hands up, who's seen cows milking themselves robotically? Isn't it? I could watch it for hours. They love it, and they're so good at it. So are the robots. And in fact, so much so, it's always the cow behind that has to push the cow out after she's done. So underneath the cows, so to speak, this is a very important Maslow hierarchy here. Underneath the cows are scientists from China, New Zealand, around the world. This is the sort of Chinese investment we really need. And then down on the ground floor are people from the medical school in Christchurch doing that genetic testing of people and of those potential products. We now know an awful lot about earthquakes in Christchurch. And here's an example. The global reinsurance industry is reinsuring Christchurch, and one of the things that has given them confidence is that Christchurch now has geotechnical data down to the lot level. This is ultimate granularity in terms of fine detail. The global reinsurance industry is really interested in that because it's allowing them to make much better assessments of their long-term risks. They really want to push that around the world. So why don't we have a global earthquake centre in Christchurch, which is indeed about prediction, it's indeed about recovery, but it's also about, and rescue, but it's also about those other things that the world desperately needs. Or how about a centre for 21st century systems? Now, at the moment, the infrastructure of Christchurch is being rebuilt on classic 19th century lines. Vast volumes of sewage and stormwater are being piped a long way across a very flat city to one processing plant. The only gesture to resilience is to put in plastic pipes and a bigger lift at every pumping station. This is pretty crazy because that's not where infrastructure is going. But there are companies around like IBM and Cisco who are investing very large sums in city systems because cities become information technology driven. Christchurch is the perfect testbed of a place that has massive new build, lots of repair of old, and some surviving infrastructure. Nobody's gone out to ask IBM and Cisco, would you like to co-invest with us in a 21st century city centre? Research centre in Christchurch. And indeed, Antarctica, it's a great logistics base, and it's a great place to see penguins without going to Christchurch, without going from Christchurch down to the ice. But it's not a place of big science. It could be. Yep. Last thought. I'm being very black and white here. The first thing is that and it's more nuanced than this. But what I think is going on, not just in these local government reforms, is what cities and towns say they want versus what the government's prepared to let them do is very different. So our cities many do, want a compact form. The government is rather more keen on urban sprawl, but that's it's not that black and white, but anyway, public transport, roads, quality urban design, some urban guidelines, wide choices in housing, narrow choices in housing. If you want it cheap, you'll have to go out into the distant suburbs. Powers to decide and act, strong central control, enough investment, only what we can afford to give you from central government, new economy, old economy, sustainability, that old economic environment balance one, local democracy, central intervention. We have got the most highly centralized funding of local government activity in the OECD, and by an extreme measure. But as Oliver Hartwich, who runs the New Zealand initiative, the merger of the Round Table and the New Zealand Institute, has shown in earlier work in the UK, is that you don't get any house price inflation in communities where the local government has full control of finances because they're properly incentivized to make all the right decisions. Wonderful review of that. And I'll just leave you with this last thing about complexity, which is that where we as a society are going, it's a common problem around the world, is we think we're trying to reduce all this complexity and we'll get through if we make things simple. So we've got a government that is trying to make things very simple with a stripped down Local Government Act or RMA or EEZ. But what is really only going to work is if we have the tools and the intelligence and the intention to deal with complexity. That's about society, that's about communities, but it needs all the tools to do that. And then if we do that, we can move on to really big issues like how we can deal with this extraordinary responsibility we have, the 5th largest oceanic resource in the world. We'd have to be radically, radically different to how we'd do that. One last thought. Johnny Rotten, Sex Pistols. I did indeed have a misspent youth. One of his great lyrics was, "You'll have no future if you don't make one for yourself." Thanks very much indeed.